Welcome to Nate's Haunted Hour, where the shadows come alive and the stories of the unknown take hold of your soul. Before we dive into tonight's terrors, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button, if you dare. Beware, dear listener, for once you enter, there's no turning back. So turn down the lights and prepare yourself for the fright of your life. You're in for an hour of chills, thrills, and tales that haunt the darkest corners of your mind. This is Nate's Haunted Hour. And don't forget, subscribing may just keep the spirits at bay, for now. Salt. The world was broken. The cataclysm had left the sky a sickly yellow and the earth scarred and empty. Detroit lay in ruins, its streets buried under ash and debris, a hollow echo of what it once was. In this wasteland, survival was a daily struggle, and even the living were haunted by worse things than death. 6 survivors found themselves running from a terror worse than the chaos above. The Butcher, a sadistic hunter who delighted in killing those too weak to fend him off. The group was desperate, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear, as they approached the gaping entrance of the abandoned salt mines beneath Detroit. "We have to go in," said Sarah, their leader, her eyes wild with desperation. "It's our only shot to lose him." "Are you sure about this?" asked Kevin, the youngest of the group, his voice barely a whisper. "People say these mines, they swallow you whole." "We don't have a choice," said Daniel, who had once been a truck driver. "Better to face whatever's down there than to die by his blade." Marie, the former paramedic, nodded, though her hands trembled. "Whatever it is, we face it together." As they ventured into the darkness, the air grew colder, and the salt-lined walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The mine felt like a beast that had swallowed them, the tunnels twisting like intestines leading into the earth's bowels. Kevin's breathing became erratic, the darkness suffocating him. He remembered his life before this nightmare, just a college kid dreaming of the future. Now he was running from death itself. As they reached a narrow passage, he tripped over an unseen stone and fell hard to the ground. His flashlight rolled away and he scrambled to his feet in terror. The entity stood before him, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes set into a face as white as bone. It moved with unnatural speed, its thin, elongated fingers reaching out like claws. Kevin tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat as those fingers closed around his skull. His last thoughts were of his mother, how he'd promised to come home safe from college. He felt his skin hardening, the warmth draining from his body, and his final scream froze into a gurgle as he turned to salt. His face twisted into an expression of sheer terror before cracking apart, his entire form disintegrating into a pile of dust on the mine floor. The others ran, but their hearts sank as they heard the crunch of salt underfoot and the sickening sound of Kevin's remains crumbling away. Panic drove them deeper into the maze-like tunnels. Jake, the mechanic, found himself lagging behind, his thoughts racing to his wife and the life they once had. He could still see her face, the way she'd smile at him after a long day's work. He'd lost her to the cataclysm, and now he was about to lose himself. He turned to see the entity gliding toward him, its hollow eyes locked onto him as if savoring his fear. Jake swung a rusted pipe he'd grabbed earlier, desperation fueling his strength. "You want me? Come on, you bastard!" he yelled, his voice cracking. The entity's movements were a blur. It wrapped its long, bony fingers around Jake's chest, squeezing with a force that crushed his ribs like brittle twigs. Jake felt his bones snap, his breath turning to fire in his lungs. His last thought was a flash of his wife's face, her gentle smile morphing into horror as he realized he'd never see her again. His body shriveled, his skin turning pale and cracked before he shattered into a mound of salt. The survivors screamed as Jake's remains scattered across the ground, the taste of salt thick on their tongues as they inhaled his disintegrated body. They knew there was no way out, but they kept running, clinging to the hope that movement meant life. Daniel and Lisa stumbled into a cavern filled with salt-encrusted corpses. The bodies seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, their faces twisted in eternal screams, reaching out as if begging to be saved. Daniel, who had driven trucks across the country, now felt like a trapped animal in this nightmare labyrinth. "Keep moving," Sarah shouted, but Daniel had already stopped, his eyes wide with terror. The entity appeared, its hollow gaze fixed on Daniel. It didn't rush. It approached with a deliberate slowness, as if enjoying the agony of its prey. Daniel's last thought was a desperate wish that he could see the open road just one more time, the freedom of the horizon far away from this darkness. The entity's hands closed around Daniel's neck, and he felt his veins turn to ice. His vision blurred, his pulse slowed, and then his flesh started to crystallize. He could feel every cell in his body transforming into solid salt. His consciousness frozen in a moment of agony before his face cracked and his body shattered into pieces. Lisa screamed, her voice echoing through the caverns. She backed away, her mind breaking under the weight of what she'd just witnessed. Her last memory was of her daughter's face, the little girl she had lost to the chaos above. She remembered reading bedtime stories to her, holding her close. Lisa collapsed to her knees, her body shaking uncontrollably. The entity towered over her, its eyeless face expressionless. It reached out and touched her forehead. In her final moment, Lisa saw her daughter's face again, but this time the eyes were hollow, the smile twisted into a scream. Lisa's skin turned white, her mouth opened in a silent cry, and then she crumbled to salt, her remains scattering like dust in the wind. Sarah was the only one left. Her breaths were ragged, her eyes wild with terror. She ran through the twisting tunnels, the entity always just a step behind, silent and unrelenting. She reached the surface, gasping as she burst into the cold air of the wasteland. The mine's entrance loomed behind her, the darkness still hungry, still watching. She fell to her knees, looking back into the abyss. The entity stood just within the shadows, its hollow eyes fixed on her, almost as if it were smiling, savoring the fear it had carved into her soul. Sarah knew then that there was no real escape. The mine had taken her friends, her hope, and left her with nothing but the curse of survival. As she stumbled away from the mine, back into the wasteland, she realized the truth. She was as hollow as the eyes that had watched her. She was still alive, but something inside her had died in that darkness, something that could never be reclaimed. The world was still broken, and now so was she. And beneath the shattered ruins of Detroit, the entity remained, a silent sentinel of death in the forgotten depths, its hollow eyes ever watching, its hunger never sated.